distant, echoing scream followed by the sound of metal doors slamming shut. That was the last thing I heard before complete darkness enveloped me in cell block D of Westgate Penitentiary. I stood frozen, my heart pounding against my chest as the temperature around me plummeted. I'm not one to believe in ghosts, but what happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about the line between our world and whatever lies beyond. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm taking you through my bone-chilling overnight stay at America's most haunted prison, an experience that left me with more questions than answers, and footage that even my skeptical mind struggles to explain. Westgate Penitentiary isn't just any abandoned prison. Built in 1867, it housed some of the country's most dangerous criminals for over a century before closing in 1991, following a series of unexplained deaths and a riot that claimed the lives of 3 guards and 7 inmates. The prison's dark history includes over 103 documented deaths, executions, murders, suicides, and countless reports of abuse and torture. Former guards and inmates have long spoken of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and inexplicable cold spots throughout the facility. What makes Westgate particularly notorious is the legend of Warden Sullivan, who ran the prison with an iron fist from 1923 to 1951. Under his watch, prisoners were subjected to experimental treatments and isolation that often drove them to madness. Sullivan himself died under mysterious circumstances in his office, found slumped over his desk with no apparent cause of death, but wearing an expression of pure terror. Former guards claimed his heavy footsteps can still be heard patrolling the halls at night. And inmates in cell block D, where the most violent offenders were housed, reported seeing his reflection in windows and metal surfaces, even decades after his death. I've always approached these stories with healthy skepticism. As someone who's investigated dozens of supposedly haunted locations, I've learned that most paranormal phenomena can be explained by drafty old buildings, overactive imaginations, or the power of suggestion. But Westgate had been on my bucket list for years, with its reputation for being the one place that can make believers out of skeptics. Getting permission to stay overnight wasn't easy. The current owners, the Historical Preservation Society, rarely allow after-hours access due to safety concerns and the building's deteriorating condition. It took months of negotiations, signed waivers, and promises to respect the site before they finally agreed. The condition that I would be accompanied by a guide for part of the evening, before being left alone from midnight until 6 a.m. The drive to Westgate was itself an exercise in building tension. Located in a remote area about 3 hours from the nearest major city, the prison sits atop a hill, its imposing stone walls and guard towers visible for miles. As I approached on that overcast March afternoon, the prison seemed to grow larger against the darkening sky, its windows like hundreds of empty eyes staring down at me. My guide, Marcus, had worked as a tour guide at Westgate for 15 years and had his fair share of unexplainable experiences. "I'm not saying I believe in ghosts," he told me as we walked through the main entrance, "but there are things that happen here that I can't explain. Equipment malfunctions, batteries draining instantly, visitors feeling touched or pushed when no one is near them." The prison was even more imposing from the inside. The main hall stretched before us, cell blocks branching off like the legs of a spider. The air was heavy with the smell of rust, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something stale and unpleasant that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. "Most of the activity happens in 3 areas," Marcus explained as we began our tour. The warden's office, the infirmary where they performed experimental treatments, and cell block D, where the most violent offenders were kept in isolation. We started in the warden's office, a surprisingly well-preserved room with a large oak desk, bookshelves, and a portrait of Warden Sullivan himself, a stern-faced man with cold eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. "People report feeling watched in here," Marcus said. "Some say they've seen the chair move or papers rustle when there's no draft." I set up some basic equipment, an EMF meter to detect electromagnetic field fluctuations, a digital thermometer, and 2 cameras with night vision capability. Nothing unusual happened during our time there, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. The infirmary was next, and this is where things started to get strange. As soon as we entered the large room with its rusted examination tables and primitive medical equipment, my EMF meter began to spike erratically. "That happens a lot in here," Marcus noted calmly. "Some people think it's just old wiring in the walls, but the electricity to this section was cut off decades ago." As we moved deeper into the room, I felt a distinct cold spot, the temperature dropping from 68 degrees to 52 in the span of about 3 feet. Marcus noticed my reaction. "You felt it too? That cold spot moves around. Sometimes it follows visitors from room to room." I was about to dismiss it as a draft when we both heard it, a low moan that seemed to come from one of the isolation cells attached to the infirmary. Marcus and I exchanged glances. "That's new," he said, his casual tone betrayed by the tension in his voice. We investigated the cells but found nothing. As we were leaving the infirmary, my camera battery, which had been at 94%, suddenly died. When I put in my backup battery, it showed only 12% despite having been fully charged that morning. By the time we reached cell block D, the sun had set completely, and we were navigating by flashlight and the dim emergency lighting that remained operational. This was the oldest part of the prison, with cells barely large enough for a bed and a toilet. The isolation cells at the end of the block were even worse, completely dark boxes where prisoners were sometimes kept for weeks or months at a time. "This is where we get the most reports of activity," Marcus said. "People hear voices, feel touched, see shadows moving between the cells. 3 different tour guides have quit after experiences in this block." As if on cue, we both heard what sounded like footsteps further down the cell block. Heavy, measured steps that echoed on the concrete floor. Marcus shined his flashlight in that direction, but the beam revealed only empty cells. "Could be the building settling," I suggested, though I didn't entirely believe it myself. "Could be," Marcus agreed, "or it could be Warden Sullivan making his rounds." We continued our tour, with Marcus sharing stories of the prison's most notorious inmates and the strange occurrences reported over the years. By 11:30 p.m., we had covered most of the facility, and it was almost time for Marcus to leave me alone for my overnight stay. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked as we stood in the main hall. "No shame in changing your mind. This place gets to everyone eventually." I assured him I was fine, though the events in the infirmary and cell block D had admittedly rattled me more than I wanted to admit. We agreed on safety protocols. I had a radio to contact security if needed, and Marcus would return at 6 a.m. sharp. "One last piece of advice," Marcus said as he prepared to leave. "If you hear someone call your name, don't answer. And if you feel a sudden urge to go to a specific part of the prison, especially the old execution chamber or the warden's office, resist it. Some visitors say they felt compelled to go to certain areas, like something was luring them." With those comforting words, Marcus left, and I was alone in Westgate Penitentiary. I decided to set up a base in the guards' break room, a relatively open space with multiple exits that felt less oppressive than the cell blocks. I arranged my cameras to monitor the hallway outside and settled in for what I expected to be a long, uneventful night. For the first hour, nothing happened. I reviewed some of the footage I'd shot earlier and made notes about the cold spot in the infirmary and the footsteps in cell block D. Around 1 a.m., I decided to do another walkthrough, starting with the main hall and working my way through the accessible areas. The prison was different at night, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. My footsteps echoed loudly, making me increasingly self-conscious about the noise I was making. I found myself walking more carefully, almost tiptoeing through the corridors. I was passing the entrance to cell block C when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. I stopped, holding my breath to listen. There it was again, a whispered word that sounded like help or possibly hell. I couldn't be sure. Logically, I knew it could be the wind finding its way through the old building. But logic wasn't particularly comforting as I stood alone in a darkened prison corridor at 1:30 in the morning. I decided to investigate, turning towards cell block C with my camera recorder. The cells in this block were larger than those in D, designed for 2 inmates rather than solitary confinement. As I moved down the row, the temperature noticeably dropped. Not dramatically like in the infirmary, but enough that I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. Then I heard it again, that same whispered word, this time clearly help, coming from a cell near the end of the block. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. The cell was empty except for the standard metal bed frame and toilet. Is someone here? I asked, feeling slightly ridiculous talking to an empty cell. Can you make that sound again if you're trying to communicate? Silence. Then, just as I was about to turn away, a loud metallic bang came from inside the cell, like someone had struck the bed frame with significant force. I jumped back, nearly dropping my camera. When I steadied myself and looked again, nothing had changed in the cell, but the temperature had dropped even further. I decided to return to my base in the break room, reviewing the footage as I walked. To my surprise, the whispers had been captured clearly on the audio, though the camera showed nothing unusual in the cell. The bang was there too, loud and distinct, but again, nothing visible had caused it. Back in the break room, I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Old buildings make noises, metal contracts in cold temperatures. Maybe there were animals living in the prison, rats or birds that could cause unexpected sounds. I was in the middle of this internal debate when the lights in the hallway, the emergency lights that had been on all night, flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, with only my flashlight and the dim light of my camera screen providing any illumination. Just a power fluctuation, I said aloud, as much to hear a human voice as to reassure myself. I waited for the backup generator to kick in, but after 5 minutes of darkness, I accepted that I would be completing my investigation without the comfort of those ambient lights. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I decided to visit the warden's office again. In retrospect, this decision seems foolish, especially after Marcus's warning about feeling compelled to visit certain areas. But at the time, it felt like a logical next step. The office had been quiet during our initial visit, and I wanted to see if the nighttime hours would yield different results. The walk to the administrative section was tense. Twice I thought I heard footsteps behind me, only to turn and find empty corridors. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than before, casting strange, elongated shadows that appeared to move independently of my movements. The warden's office was as we had left it, though it seemed smaller and more oppressive in the darkness. I set up my equipment again, the EMF meter, thermometer, and static camera while I held another. Almost immediately, the EMF meter began to register activity, the needle swinging into the red zone. Is someone here with me? I asked. Warden Sullivan, are you present in this office? The temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically, from 65 degrees to 47 in seconds. My breath fogged in front of me as I continued. If you're here, can you give me a sign? Move something in the room? Make a sound? The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Then, just as I was about to speak again, I heard it, the distinct sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside, approaching the office door. I turned toward the sound, my camera trained on the doorway. The footsteps stopped just outside. Hello? I called, my voice sounding thin and uncertain. Marcus, is that you? No response, but now I could hear breathing, deep, labored breathing, as if someone had been running. I moved toward the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it must be audible on the recording. The doorway was empty. The hallway beyond was dark and still. But as I stood there, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I felt something brush past me. Not a touch exactly, more like the displacement of air as someone moves very close to you. I spun around, returning to the office, and that's when I saw it. The chair behind the warden's desk had moved. I was certain it had been pushed under the desk when I entered, but now it was pulled out, angled slightly as if someone had just stood up from it. My rational mind raced for explanations. Had I bumped it without noticing? Was there a draft strong enough to move a heavy wooden chair? But before I could settle on an explanation, the temperature plummeted further. My camera's battery indicator began to drain rapidly before my eyes, dropping from 68% to 12% in seconds. I decided it was time to leave the office. As I gathered my equipment, the door, which I had left open, slowly swung shut with a decisive click. I stood frozen, staring at the closed door, my mind racing between logical explanations and the growing certainty that I was not alone in that room. With shaking hands, I approached the door and turned the handle. It opened easily, revealing the empty hallway beyond. I stepped out, relief washing over me as I left the oppressive atmosphere of the office behind. That relief was short-lived. As I made my way back toward the main hall, I heard footsteps again, this time running, coming from behind me and moving fast. I broke into a run myself, irrationally terrified of being caught by whatever was pursuing me. I reached the main hall breathing hard and turned to face the corridor I just fled. Nothing was there. The footsteps had stopped. But as I stood catching my breath, I heard something that made my blood run cold. My name, whispered from somewhere in the darkness, clear and unmistakable. Remembering Marcus's warning, I didn't respond. Instead, I retreated to my base in the break room, where I spent the next hour reviewing footage and trying to calm my racing heart. The recording showed the chair moving, slightly but definitely, and captured the sound of my name being called, though there was no visible source for the voice. By 4 a.m., I had convinced myself to continue the investigation. If nothing else, I was determined to get footage of cell block D, which we had only briefly explored earlier. This decision led to the experience I described at the beginning of this video: the scream, the slamming door, and the complete darkness that enveloped me. I had been walking through cell block D, documenting the isolation cells, and all the lights in my equipment failed simultaneously. My flashlight, camera light, even the small LED on my audio recorder. In the same instant, I heard what sounded like a scream of pure anguish, followed by the deafening slam of the cell door. I stood in perfect darkness, unable to see even my hand in front of my face. The air around me felt heavy and charged, as if a thunderstorm were brewing indoors. Then I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, firm and unmistakably real. I'd like to say I reacted with courage, that I turned to confront whatever had touched me. The truth is, I ran, blindly, desperately, colliding with walls and cell bars as I sought escape from that oppressive darkness. Somehow I found my way back to the main hall, where a few emergency lights were still functioning. I spent the remaining hours until dawn in that hall, unwilling to return to any of the cell blocks or offices. At 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before our agreed meeting time, Marcus found me there, sitting with my back against the wall, my equipment gathered around me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his attempt at humor falling flat as he took in my appearance. "I'm not sure what I saw," I replied honestly, "but something happened in cell block D, something I can't explain." As we left Westgate with the first light of dawn breaking over the prison walls, Marcus shared one final piece of information. The isolation cell at the end of Block D, the one where you heard the scream and the door slam, that's where inmate 217 died in 1943. They found him with his face frozen in a scream, his hands bloody from clawing at the door. The official cause of death was heart failure, but the guards who found him swore he had been terrified to death.